For me, this present conference actually comes out of Kilimanjaro, and I will try and explain to you that in all my life, I was actually born in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, or some call it Tanzania, and was at school in Nairobi in Kenya. And often from Nairobi, it was 250 miles, kilometers away, was Mount Kilimanjaro. On a clear day, you could see this enormous dome sticking up, and I thought to myself, one day I must climb Kilimanjaro. But the years rolled by, and it seemed becoming more and more remote possibility. And then in 1999, actually almost exactly now, July 1999, I had the opportunity to go with a group up Kilimanjaro. And when I was preparing for it, my wife, actually Anna, came to me and said, wouldn't it be wonderful to pray from the top of Kilimanjaro? And then in my quiet time, it's like the Lord spoke really into, the Lord speaks to us in different ways, but He speaks to me, I get a sort of chain of thoughts come, and then suddenly something says to me, that's important. And I've learned over the years that that's a particular way the Lord seems to speak to me. And I got quite excited about this. I thought, well, maybe this is one of the reasons I meant to climb Kilimanjaro. And we were praying about what that means. And Isaiah 42 came to mind for some reason. I started reading Isaiah 42, and Anna came with Psalm 97. And both of them are to do with lifting up the name of God and bringing down false gods. And the one day when I was thinking about this, I started writing, and I'll explain later, a prayer just flowed, and I wrote this prayer for Africa. And I had this feeling I must write these two passages from the Bible and the prayer on a scroll, and if and when I get to the top of Kilimanjaro, I will say the prayer there and leave it in a crevice in a rock as a sort of symbolic gesture of we're asking God to lift up His name in Africa and bring down the false gods and bring revival. Now, that's an aerial view of Kilimanjaro, and for those of you who don't know it, but there's two main peaks. It's the largest freestanding mountain in the world. In fact, so from a flat plain, you get this enormous 6,000 meter mountain sticking out. And it's, as you see, it's a volcano. It's got a crater, and the very top peak is here. And I won't go into all the details, but it's interesting that when we were climbing up, I overheard one of the climbers talking to another one as we were walking up. He's saying his wife was a very spiritual lady, and she's obviously a New Age lady, and she had given him some special crystals to plant on the top of Kilimanjaro to improve the spirituality of the world. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, I'm going to pray a prayer for bringing down false gods, and now this really is like he's going to plant a false god up there. So I thought about that. But the interesting thing was, on this particular climb, there were 35 climbers, and I kept finding myself interacting with just a few. There was one who turned out he's the son of I believe, an Anglican bishop in Cape Town. And then there was a couple from the Orange Free State, quite an elderly couple. And then there was a man I called the intellectual skeptic, because he was always very skeptical of everything, and it seemed to come over as being very skeptical of religion. And then there was a fairly elderly Jewish man who had a very colorful, some people say colorful language, but he was definitely very aggressively against any mention of God. But as we went through 5 days of climbing, without any arrangement, I found myself continually being in their company, sort of as if it was meant to be. And then when we're getting, I'll just give you a bit of, before we go on with the story. In fact, before I say that, on the way up, I had one interesting interaction with this intellectual skeptic, and he was saying what a beautiful sight this is, and I said to him, it sort of reminds me of the Creator, and he sort of stopped in his tracks and he turned around, and I said to him, it reminds me of a debate that I heard once happened on a BBC actually, and there was an atheist and a pastor, and the chairman in between. And at one point, the atheist said to the chairman, what I can't stand about people like this pastor here is he expects me to believe that some hypothetical God made everything out of nothing. So the pastor thought for a minute, and I told this story to this man. He said, the pastor thought for a moment, then he said, yes, it does take a step of faith to believe that God created everything out of apparently nothing. He says, but my atheist friend here expects me to believe that nothing made everything out of nothing. and this chap stopped in his tracks and he said, I like it. I like it a lot, he said. Anyway, that was the first introduction to that particular gentleman. This, by the way, it's a magnificent sight. This is towards the top, and these are glaciers, which are 40 or 50 meters of ice. And unfortunately, the predictions are they're melting so fast that within 20 years or so, there may not be any glaciers left with global warming. This is probably my favorite picture here, where we're looking at over a glacier, and this is a cloud layer, which normally you'd see above you. And of course, the plains are far below. So it was an amazing experience for me to be up there, and actually supernatural in the sense as well that I wasn't that fit. And the last night, you have to leave at 11 o'clock at night, and you have to climb up this very steep slope with a lot of loose material. You tend to slip back as much as you go forward. And the aim is to get to the rim of the crater as the sun is coming up, so you can see the sunrise. And when we were climbing, it was actually full moon. So at sunrise, you would see the full moon setting on the other side. It was beautiful. And it was a wonderful, clear night. It was ideal weather. But in spite of that, at least 3 times on that climb, I came to the point where I was puffing and panting so much and leaning on the stick. I came to absolute stop, and I was saying to myself, I've got to get to the top, but I just cannot move another step. I'd got to that stage. And then after a while, I felt a little push from behind. And I hadn't even got the energy to look around and see who was pushing me. But 3 times I had this little push which got me going again. And when I got back to Paarl, some of the ladies, or some of them maybe here, also said that particular night they woke up in the middle of the night with the conviction they must pray for Mike. So I believe that was part of the reason I got to the top. Anyway, I finally got to the rim at the top, and this young African man who lives in Moshi came up to me and says, well done, Mambo. So I said, oh, is it you who pushed me? He says, yes, Mambo. So I gave him a big hug and I burst into tears. But that was the sort of, it was really quite emotional. Now this is now moving up towards, that's the moon setting on the other side, and the sun is behind us, and we're heading towards the highest peak. And this was me, believe it or not, right at the top, dressed up in all my warm togs. And then this is a particular point I stood, and I was all alone. In fact, I'd intended to pray with brother-in-law and daughter-in-law, because they were also on the climb. But as we got towards the end, I wondered whether we would all make it to the top. And the night before we moved up to the top, I gave Rob a copy of the prayer that I was going to pray at the top. And he took it into the tent where Tamini was, and she was busy reading her Bible in the tent. And when Rob came in and said, oh, Mike's just given us this thing, and it's all about Isaiah 42, I think, she says, whoa, I'm reading Isaiah 42. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, as it happened, at this point there was nobody except myself. So I prayed this prayer over this wonderful view, and I buried it in a crevice. And then we came all the way down, and as we were going down, I remembered that some of the Kiswahili language, which I knew some of in Kenya, and so I started rehearsing a thank you speech to the porters, because we had porters. It was a very civilized climb. You only have to take yourself up in a little bag. The rest is taken by porters. And I asked the team leader, would it be in order if I gave a thank you speech to the porters at the end? So I was rehearsing this Swahili speech all the way down, not very long. And then all the porters were lined up, as you see, and all the climbers were behind me, most of them, except the one chap. And I more or less said, look, we were so grateful for all the help these people had given us. And I'd also noticed that as we climbed up, they were singing Christian hymns the whole time. And I said, it seems to me as if you all love Jesus very much. And there were lots of nods all over. I said, well, that's wonderful, because I also love Jesus a lot. And then I told them a little bit about my background. My father was a doctor in Tanzania, and I'd learned a little bit of Swahili. And then I thanked them all again. And I just stopped the speech, and a lady behind said, now we want an English translation. So I thought, okay, Lord, now I'm really sticking my neck out. So I gave an English translation, and there was a total hush. And then we went and had a meal together. And again, I found myself sitting next to the intellectual skeptic, and he was very friendly. I was quite pleased to say. But then there was a Land Rover going down the last little stretch to the hotel at Moshi, and I happened to be standing next to the Land Rover, so they said, would you like a lift down? So I said, fine. So I was the first to arrive at the hotel. And when I booked in, they said, do you mind sharing with 3 other men? I said, no, it's fine. So I went and had a shower, which we hadn't had for 5 or 6 days. And I just came out of the shower, and the first chap who came was our Jewish chap. And he looked at me and he said, are you in this room? I said, yes. He said, oh, so I suppose no dirty jokes. And so I didn't say anything. I said, by the way, it's a wonderful shower. Go and have a shower. Then I was standing there. The next chap who turned up was this young son of the bishop. And he came up to me, and the only reason he would have come to me was because I'd witnessed to the porters. And he said, an incredible thing happened to me on the mountain. On that last stretch going up, I totally ran out of energy. I sat down, and I could not move. And then he said, suddenly, I got so much energy, I couldn't believe it. I stood up, and I climbed right to the top. And he said he looked at his watch, and he realized it was 4 in in South Africa, at the same time, in fact. And he said, I remember that before I came on this trip, I asked my father, who was the bishop, to pray for me, especially on that last stretch. And he said when he looked at his watch, he realized it was the time his father was praying for him, that he got that strength. So he came and witnessed that to me, which was very encouraging. He'd hardly finished. And the husband of this couple from Orange Free State he came up to me and said, he just wants to say he's so pleased that I shared. Because just before they came on this climb, they went to church, and there was an altar call, and he went forward to recommit his life to the Lord. And it was very meaningful for him, but he never had the courage to share his faith with anybody. And he said the fact that I'd witnessed there in public had made him realize that he could have the courage to share his faith. So I thought, wow, Lord, a lot of things coming out of this little thing. But the highlight was amazing. The leader of the African leader there, he said, look, we're all going to go to a Chinese restaurant in Moshi tonight, and all of you have got to share in just a couple of minutes the highlight of this mountain climb. So various people shared. And then this gentleman who had been given these crystals got up, and he was incredibly emotional, and he had to pause every now and again. He says, he'd heard the whole story. His wife had given him these crystals to plant on the top of the mountain. And he says, when I got to the top of the mountain, it was such an amazing sight, and I was so overwhelmed with it that I clean forgot to bury the crystals. And he said, I only realized this when halfway down the mountain, I was sleeping in my tent because you spend one day on halfway down. He said, I was in my tent, and I suddenly remembered, wow, I didn't plant the crystals. What am I going to say to my wife? And then he thought, well, I'm still on the mountain, so I suppose it's okay. I'll get out before it's light. There's a little kopje, a little ridge there. I'll climb on that ridge, and I'll dig a hole, and I'll bury the crystals, and then I will have done what I was supposed to do. And then he said, so I got up before it was light. I climbed up this little kopje, and I dug a hole, and I buried the crystal. And then it was nearly sunrise, so I thought, I'm going to wait for the sunrise. And then he said, then I realized what I'd done. And he was really emotional. He couldn't speak for a few minutes. And then we were all wondering, what had he done? He said, as it became light, I looked and I saw that where I had buried the crystals was where the porters come to the toilet. Now, and I thought to myself, Lord, if I had been him, I would have said nothing. I'm sure you would have said nothing. But the Holy Spirit must have prompted him to tell this whole story, I believe, to tell me that what was prayed on that mountain was meaningful. We'd left that thing, we'd prayed, Lord, bring down the false gods, have mercy on Africa, forgive our sins, heal our land, heal our continent. And what's he saying? Well, I'm going to answer it, because what do I think of the false gods? I'm going to bury them in the toilet. So we then had to catch the plane the next day, and it was free seating. You just go in and sit wherever you like. And I was almost the last to get in at the back. And I looked down the plane, and I thought, sure, it's full. There must be a seat for me somewhere. And a lady waved, said, come sit here next to one of the windows. So I sat there, and guess who's next to me? Well, the lady's next to me. Then it's the Jewish chap who shared. Behind us, the skeptic and the young man, son of the bishop. Okay, and of course, this lady had a loud voice, and almost from the beginning, she started to talk about. She said, you know, she once went on an Alpha course, and it was very meaningful to her. So we were talking spiritual things pretty loud, and I thought to myself, well, various people can hear. Anyway, we got to Johannesburg, and the Jewish chap stood up in the aisle waiting for the doors to open, and he got a bag out and whatever. And then in a loud voice, again, why would he say a thing like this? He suddenly said in a loud voice, well, maybe there is a God after all. Okay. And I thought, wow. So I came back from this. It was a spiritual experience. And so especially Isaiah 42 had a profound meaning to me. Now, Johan later and Andre will share a little bit about other inputs that led us to this conference. But when we were praying about it and coming together, Andre was meditating and trying to listen to the Lord. And without knowing about this Isaiah 42, he felt the Lord was saying to him that Isaiah 42 was the theme passage for this conference. And we got together, the three of us, and Andre said he had got this passage, and I thought, wow, Isaiah 42. So that excited me, you know, because it seemed to me a confirmation that this was significant. God was saying something, and I think you've been handed out this sort of breakdown of Isaiah 42. I really would encourage you to meditate and read it over and over and see there's a lot of things being spoken in that particular passage.